Many assume childhood is merely a stage that, once passed, recedes into the past, a bundle of recollections, faded pictures, processed or buried wounds and habits that adulthood ought to wipe clean. Carl Gustav Jung disputed this view in a fundamental way. A child resides within every grown person. This is not a mere symbol or sentimental echo, but an active psychic presence, a living archetype that quietly works within the adult psyche, steering thoughts, undermining choices, warping relationships, and molding whole identities. Jung believed our inner child is more than a memory. It's a living force within us. Comment 1. If you've ever felt like your past still shapes your present reactions. Comment 2. If you've tried to leave the past behind, but something keeps pulling you back. This inner presence, Jung's archetypal child, is anything but inert. It does not slumber, hoping to fade. Rather, it exerts a profound, frequently unconscious vitality that bears our most pristine potentials, creativity, sensitivity, wonder, alongside our most ancient injuries, abandonment, rejection, humiliation, and invalidation. In clinical work, Jung found that much adult distress stems from suppressing the inner child. Rather than acknowledging, tending, or integrating it, we conceal it. We don masks of adulthood roles, rationalizations, and compulsions to keep it confined. The cost is steep: neuroses, crises of meaning, persistent anxiety, emotional dependence, hollowness, and the relentless replay of self-defeating patterns. The difficulty is that ignoring this child does not make it vanish. Denial drives it into the shadows where it appears in masked, chaotic forms. Adults who explode over small critiques, feel unseen in intimacy, chase approval from authority, or fail to set boundaries are not necessarily immature. In the usual sense, they are being directed by an unseen, unacknowledged wounded child. Here is a subtle but potent aspect of Jung's view. The child is not a flaw to fix, but a presence to recognize. It needs rightful room inside the adult mind. Genuine growth for Jung arises not from rejection of the inner child, but from cultivating an internal parental ego, the capacity to self-care from within, and to sustain dialogue between the hurt part and the protective part. This marks the start of real emotional maturity, not stifling pain, but hearing it, not posing as strong, but cultivating inner sturdiness. The invitation here is to revisit a neglected layer of your psyche. The inner child is not a barrier to adulthood, but a gateway to authenticity, creativity, and emotional liberty. Grasping this is more than therapy. It is psychic self-preservation in a culture that urges self-disconnection. By meeting the gaze of the child we were, and still are, we may see why we feel exhausted, adrift, and needy. The answer was never outside. It has always lived within small, tender, and unseen until now. For Jung, archetypes are not abstractions or poetic flourishes. They are living psychic patterns residing in the collective unconscious. They powerfully mold behavior, perception, and feeling beyond mere reason. Among them, the inner child is especially consequential. Jung did not mean a wistful remembrance of youth, but a functioning psychic center, a reservoir of emotional energy that endures regardless of age. It operates now, surfacing in reactions, longings, irrational fears, and our style of relating to people and the world. People often equate the inner child with childhood scenes or memories. Jung's account goes further. The child symbolizes the developing self, both the start of individuation and the unrealized potential ahead. It is at once fragile and sacred, holding spontaneity, sensitivity, curiosity, and creativity, while also containing unhealed traumas and the raw feelings of helplessness, shame, and abandonment. This presence shapes adult conduct quietly, yet powerfully. When neglected, it shows up as outsized reactions, emotional flare-ups, unreasonable insecurity, abandonment, anxiety approval, seeking and low tolerance for critique or frustration. Countless adults, including leaders, parents, and outwardly successful people, are steered by a wounded child. Status offers no protection. The inner child seeks only acknowledgement. The child archetype is double-edged. It can lead us toward healing or fuel our deepest dysregulation. Integration opens access to creativity, intuition, and ease. Repression drives self-sabotage. Hence, Jung regarded this figure as central to the unconscious, likening neglect of the inner child to losing a part of one's soul, and warning that growth efforts without this reconnection are bound to fail. Not every inner child appears alike. Jung noted varied expressions, each with distinct needs and distortions. Some seize control quietly, others clamor for notice. All, however, exert influence. To grasp how this force shapes us, we must learn its many faces, which is precisely what the next section will examine. Before we explore the three faces of the inner child, it's essential to pause and realize this. The inner child is not merely a trace of the past. It is a way of being. It does not live in memory, but in reflex. When you overreact to criticism, when success feels hollow, or when connection feels unsafe despite your desire for it, that's not logic. It's emotional memory resurfacing. The unacknowledged child doesn't simply whisper from the past. It reappears as present emotion. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Naming the forms of the inner child is not just about understanding patterns. It's the beginning of reclaiming your psychic energy from the unconscious. We are not seeking a solution. We are seeking the truth. And sometimes the first truth is this: the most vulnerable part of you is still alive, and it deserves to be heard. The three primary expressions of the inner child that Jung described, and the ways each may quietly organize your most entrenched patterns. If this resonates, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for your support. Jung went beyond naming the inner child as a single phenomenon. His clinical observations showed that this archetype appears in several forms within adults, each with distinct needs, assets, and distortions. These are not strict boxes, but overlapping patterns that underlie our conduct. Grasping these faces helps explain the origins of our most reflexive and painful adult reactions. The first form is the wounded child. It bears overt and covert trauma, abandonment, rejection, emotional neglect, physical or symbolic harm, and persistent invalidation. Often very early, this child learned that voicing needs was risky, seeking attention was shaming, and trust brought hurt. When unintegrated, the wounded child shows up as fear of closeness, ongoing anxiety, codependent dynamics, emotional hypervigilance, mistrust, and a hollow feeling that success cannot satisfy. It drives us to treat criticism as existential threat, perceive rejection where none exists, and reenact self-abandonment. The second face is the eternal child pure eternus. Whereas the wounded child is anchored in the past, the eternal child seeks escape. This part resists growing up, shuns responsibility, and avoids frustration. It craves novelty, instant gratification, unearned admiration, and recoils from limits or commitments. In adulthood, it may present as habitual procrastination, unstable bonds, resistance to routine difficulty sustaining long-term projects, or the sense that adulthood is confinement. Jung did not moralize this pattern. He viewed it as childhood vitality, lacking a mature channel for expression. The third expression is the divine child embodying our most profound creative, spiritual, and intuitive potential. It is the part that remains open to life's mystery and experiences existence as sacred possibility. From it arise insight, authentic compassion, and the faculty for wonder. Yet this aspect is frequently stifled by the suffering of the other two. Lacking room to appear, it retreats and becomes hard to reach, leaving adults estranged from their creativity and purpose. Jung held that most people operate chiefly under the wounded child's sway, responding from scarcity and survival. We look to romantic partners to supply missing parental care, treat criticism as personal rejection, and unconsciously script adult patterns that replay childhood narratives. These patterns can feel so familiar they become invisible. Comment 1. If you recognize the wounded child in your own reactions. Comment 2. If you're still unsure how this concept applies to your life. This pattern is not weakness. It reflects a potent archetype acting outside awareness. Identifying the three faces is more than theory. It is a gateway to profound self-knowledge. Naming which child is active at a given time is the first step toward reclaiming authorship of our inner life. To proceed, we must see how early on we learn to conceal the inner child behind roles and masks, strategies that appear protective, but in fact harm us. The next section addresses these masks of maturity and the ways they suppress the inner child. Early in life, we are taught that some emotions are unacceptable. Intense feeling signals. Weakness crying is disgraceful. Relying on others is shameful. And being highly sensitive is defective. Over time, this emotional conditioning rooted in repression and tacit punishment trains us to don masks, strength control, independence, maturity. We assemble a socially acceptable self, meant to please, perform, and avert rejection. Yet this self often feels hollow, constructed on the ongoing denial of the inner child. Jung noted that suppressing the inner child in the name of maturity is a major driver of contemporary psychological distress. Repression does not remove pain, it relocates it. What consciousness dismisses the unconscious archives. Suppressed anger morphs into anxiety. Unmet needs become compulsions. Smothered vulnerability appears as addiction, self-sabotage, or psychosomatic symptoms. We master concealment instead of healing. These masks are diverse. One is the responsible adult who cares for everyone except themselves, driven by an inner child, convinced love is earned only through usefulness. Another is the strong and invulnerable persona, needing no one, never crying, handling everything alone, yet propelled by an inner child, compelled to grow up prematurely. There is also the facade of success, a person who accomplishes, performs, and impresses, yet feels drained from endlessly seeking approval from parents who may never have genuinely recognized them. Such masks are largely unconscious strategies to secure emotional safety in a world that has penalized our vulnerability. The difficulty is that these strategies push us further from our genuine identity. They open a rift between the authentic self and the persona presented to others. The wider this distance becomes, the more intensely we experience inner emptiness. We often try to fill that void through consumption, distraction, anesthetizing relationships, or even a shallow spiritual veneer. Yet none of these substitutions can replace psychological truth. The inner child does not fade away with time. It waits. It waits to be recognized, heard, and embraced. Until that occurs, it tends to sabotage not from ill will, but because this is its only available language to secure our attention. Many adults remain trapped in this loop for decades, dismissing the inner child in the name of maturity, and thereby cultivating an impoverished emotional life, shallow connections, and repeated existential crises. They assume the solution is to be tougher, more productive, and more rational, when in truth, what is missing is the opposite: sensitivity, attentive listening, and presence. What is absent is an inner figure able to care for the child who was previously uncared for. In other words, an internal protector and nurturer is missing. Jung named this figure the internal paternal ego, a psychic function that enables the adult to become for themselves the parent they never received. This marks the genuine beginning of healing. And this is what we will discuss next. If the inner child operates as a living force within us, how do we live alongside it without letting its wounds dominate us? Carl Jung's response is both profound and unexpectedly practical. The task is not to repress the child, but to cultivate within oneself an adult who can competently care for it. Jung termed this the internal paternal ego, an inner parental function able to embrace, protect, and provide what the wounded child never obtained from the outside world. Contrary to common belief, emotional maturity does not mean abandoning the inner child. It means forming a relationship with it. This, however, requires something few have cultivated: conscious self-welcoming. The internal paternal ego is the capacity to observe oneself, to recognize when the wounded child has taken the wheel, and rather than reacting impulsively or suppressing it, to initiate inner dialogue by saying, "I see your pain. I am here. I will not abandon you." This seemingly simple inner stance can be revolutionary. Consider an ordinary scenario. Someone rejects or criticizes you. You notice an outsized reaction: anger, profound sadness, or an impulse to retreat and isolate. Rather than reacting on autopilot, the paternal ego steps in. It discerns that the suffering belongs not to the adult, but to the wounded child who is re-experiencing an old abandonment or invalidation. This recognition radically alters the internal dynamic. You shift from reactivity to intentional self-care. This process lies at the core of genuine psychological maturity. Developing an inner parental ego isn't easy, but it's powerful. Comment 1 if you've ever tried to comfort yourself during a moment of emotional overwhelm. Comment 2 if you tend to suppress those feelings instead. It is not about growing cold, distant, or emotionally indifferent, common misconceptions about adulthood. It is in fact the opposite. It concerns cultivating an inner presence that can hold pain without becoming fused with it. It is the capacity to be both the feeling child and the caring adult at once. Such integration is what turns a fragmented psyche into a functional one. However, this cannot be achieved through rational insight alone. The paternal ego must be deliberately cultivated. It calls for practice, clear intention, and above all, commitment to emotional truth. Many attempt to heal childhood wounds exclusively via reading, meditation, or traditional therapy. While these can help, they do not substitute for the internal labor of learning to care for oneself as a good parent would a sensitive child. This is where we enter the realm of reparenting, the practice of giving the inner child what it never received. In the next section, we will examine precisely how to do this, not as theory, but as practice. Which attitudes, inner positions, and behaviors cultivate a new kind of connection with your wounded inner child, a connection that no longer relies on external circumstances, but arises from within. Many assume time heals childhood wounds, that maturity, independence, and emotional autonomy suffice to move beyond the past. Yet the reality is harsher. Time does not mend what remains ignored. The inner child's wounds stay open, not merely in memory, but in the body, in our relationships, in automatic responses, and in patterns repeating across generations. This is why Jung proposed a radical and deeply transformative route: reparenting. To reparent oneself is to deliberately become the adult you needed as a child. It is not a matter of returning to the past, endlessly reliving trauma, or dwelling in lamentation. Rather, it entails establishing here and now a genuine relationship with the most sensitive and injured part of your psyche, and providing what your early caregivers, limited, unaware, or themselves traumatized, could not. This involves giving emotional validation, inner safety, firm boundaries, and above all, permission to exist as you are. The process begins with listening, deep listening. Not the intellectual listening that attempts to rationalize pain, but the emotional listening that receives what emerges without trying to fix it. The inner child does not seek fixing. It longs to be recognized. It wants assurance that its pain is meaningful, its fear, not madness, and its longing for love, not excessive. The reparented adult is not invulnerable, but someone who can meet their vulnerability without self-betrayal. Reparenting further requires setting internal boundaries. Frequently, the inner child looks to others for what the conscious adult has not yet learned to provide. It pursues protection in dysfunctional bonds, validation on social media, and love in relationships that demand self-diminishment for acceptance. Learning to say no to such impulses is not rejection, but protection. It is akin to saying, "You no longer need to beg for love. I am here. I take care of you now." Another essential facet of reparenting is practicing emotional self-regulation. This entails cultivating the capacity to soothe oneself, to remain present during crises, and to find comfort without compulsion or escape. These acts are simple yet powerful. Pausing to breathe when anxiety surges, writing to oneself as if consoling a real child, and choosing to step back from toxic environments even when it hurts. Each action sends a quiet yet decisive message to the unconscious. I will not abandon you anymore. Over time, this work shifts something profoundly within. The wounded child ceases to scream because it is finally heard. Impulsive reactions lessen because an inner adult is now present and in charge. Relationships evolve because the emptiness no longer insists on being filled at any price. Energy, once imprisoned in defenses and repetition, starts to flow, and with it, return creativity, sensitivity, and a genuine zest for life. This captures the essence of true healing, not erasing the past, but building a present in which old pain is accepted. At its core, reparenting oneself is revolutionary. It declares that the story need not end at its interruption, that there is a new possibility not to rewrite events, but to transform how they live within you now. Yet something even more powerful occurs when the inner child ceases to be a burden and is recognized as a guide. It transforms. And this transformation is what we will discuss in the final part. For when the inner child is heard and tended to, it discloses its true potential, not as a problem to fix, but as a key to a new life. Something profound unfolds when, after years or decades, the inner child is finally heard. Pain that once appeared as chronic anxiety, emotional dependencies, destructive bonds, and an insatiable emptiness begins to soften and dissolve. What emerges is more than relief. It is power, not aggressive or performative, but a quiet strength born of reconnection with exiled parts of the self. When the child is no longer pathologized and is accepted as essential to your being, It no longer operates from the shadows. It no longer needs to sabotage your life to capture your attention. It need not scream within whenever someone rejects, criticizes, or overlooks you, because it now knows it is not alone. There is an adult present, an adult who is present, protective, and available, an adult who has learned to love, not because it was taught, but because it chose not to perpetuate abandonment. At this juncture, something almost magical occurs. Pain yields to creativity. Scarcity gives way to genuine connection. Anxiety transforms into presence. When the inner child feels safe, it reveals its highest aspect, the divine child. The one unafraid to feel, create, explore, and be enchanted. The one who carries life's deepest meaning within. Jung maintained that the child symbolizes wholeness. When integrated, a person stops living in fragmentation, split between persona and shadow, between outward display and silent suffering. True freedom begins when self-conflict ends, when you no longer don masks to deserve love, nor shrink for acceptance, when you become the very home you once sought in others. This marks the turning point. And it does not originate from the outside. It doesn't arise from courses, relationships, or hollow promises. It emerges from the radical act of turning inward with courage and saying, I see you. I am here for you. I will not abandon you anymore. That moment when you say, I will not abandon you anymore, is not merely a comfort phrase. It is an inner initiation ritual. Jung called this the beginning of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. Turning inward, instead of chasing external validation, is a rebellion against a culture that glorifies detachment and disconnection. Every time you choose to stay with your pain instead of fleeing from it, you are rewiring your nervous system with a new truth. Safety doesn't come from control. It comes from presence. And the inner child knows this, not through words, but through felt experience. It senses it in your breath, in your tone, in the gentleness you offer yourself. This is no longer just therapy. It becomes something sacred. Because when you reconcile with the child within you, also reconcile with life itself. This signals the start of a new life. A life that is more whole, more truthful, and lighter. A life where mere survival is no longer the aim you can finally live. Healing the inner child transforms not just your emotions, but your whole way of living. Comment 1 if you're just beginning this journey. Comment 2 if you've already started and can feel the shift happening. Now that you've reached this point, I want to ask you something. What moment in your life made you feel your inner child needed someone the most? Share your answer in the comments. Your story can move and inspire others who are on the same path. And if this video resonated with you, please don't keep it to yourself. Like it and share it with someone who needs this message. And, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Because this is only the beginning. In the next video, we will continue to deepen this inner journey. And you need to watch it, because it will be just as important as this one. Your transformation does not end here. See you there.